Greetings, webheads, and welcome to a very special episode of Witty Banter, yet another Marvel Crisis Protocol podcast. I'm Patrick.
I'm Alex.
I'm David.
This is JP.
And I'm Will.
That's right, webheads. We are joined by Will Shick, Vice President of Creative Development and Strategy at AMG. Will, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be on my first Witty Banter.
Maybe not exactly your first, but that's a different story for another day.
They don't need to know that.
We don't need to know, the webheads don't need to know that this is our second take because I screwed up the recording the first time. Nobody needs to know that at all. Before we get started, Will, can you describe just a little bit about what you do and what your role is at Atomic Mass Games? And then David had a really cool idea. I mean, you have an incredibly cool job where you work with and play games for a living. So what do you do for fun? Are games still fun, or does it feel like work?
All right. I like it. So my role with the fancy long title at Atomic Mass is effectively I oversee all of the product development process. So I work very closely with game development. I work very closely with graphic design. I work very closely with creative direction under Dallas Kemp. So art, sculpting, engineering, all of that stuff. To make sure that the cohesive vision for what we want to bring to the tabletop is accomplished. And I work with a lot of talented individuals and kind of keep them all on the same track and coordinate between them and make sure that, you know, the art looks like the sculpts, looks like the game rules, all of this different stuff. And then another big part of my job is product planning and logistics. So I control like the 5-year schedule, and then I'm always looking at where we're sitting in terms of where we want to go next, what's going to be healthy for the game through discussions with game dev, and then watching kind of like marketing and those types of things. I do a little bit of liaisoning with Asmodee as well, which is our publisher and distributor. So we as the studio are effectively the band, and they are the record label. We make the music. They press and distribute the records for everyone, if you're old enough to remember those glory days of the music industry. So I do go to meetings with, you know, the distribution teams. I do trainings, that kind of stuff, representing the studio and helping them understand the product line so that they know what they're getting into, so that they're able to get it to market better and things like that. But the vast majority of my job is all creative based and working with very talented people to kind of bring our vision for these games to life. As far as if games are still fun, absolutely. I still regularly play games consistently. Like, we have pretty much standing game nights every weekend. I've got a huge collection of different games, and I am not very picky when it comes to what kind of tabletop game I'll play. So card games, TCGs, CCGs, board games, miniature war games, like you name it, I'll probably play it. Even a little bit of RPGs from time to time, although that one was never really a huge part of my gaming repertoire, but I have had a lot of fun when I found a group to hang out with and do that. So I find it really enjoyable, and I think part of that really helps, you know, kind of the job that I get to do and the work that I get to do, because being able to experience all these different great tabletop games and see how they do things and dive into the mechanics and kind of understand what they did here, what I would have done differently, that kind of stuff. I get to bring all that to the job. So I think it's really the best folks in game, you know, creation are usually the ones who love it the most. But I'm very able to like disconnect myself from the work, and I'll think about the game critically later, but I'll really enjoy the experience while I'm there. So I do that a lot. When I'm not playing games, my primary thing that I love to do kind of as a hobby is cooking. So I really got into cooking about 10 years ago. I was always kind of the primary meal maker for the house anyway, but something clicked and I realized that it was a very creative process. And so I just started watching a lot of YouTube videos and really diving into like the philosophy and the theory behind cooking and all these different things. And I started to master different dishes. And ever since then, it's just been a blast. Like, I really love the fact that you can take a bunch of different ingredients and then through the knowledge that I've gained, be able to creatively put them together into things that nourish and feed people. And so those are kind of the two things that I do for fun and have a lot of joy out of.
Cool. Thank you. So we're just going to kind of go round the horn, and we've got some questions we'd like to ask you. Again, we really appreciate you taking the time for this. David, you're up first.
So before I ask my question, you got to settle a debate. Since Patrick is wearing a Batman shirt, we're
Uh-huh.
wondering if you technically work for Marvel.
Oh, no, technically I don't. I work for Asmodee. Asmodee signs the checks. Asmodee does have a licensing agreement with Marvel. So, I would say we were partners, but I am not disallowed from hanging out with folks in Batman shirts. So we're safe there. We're safe.
Thank heavens for that.
All right, so on to my question. So, I really, really like Apocalypse, and I really like his design, and I really love the Horseman mechanic, and I love that it promotes like players to play affiliated rosters because you can get like cool benefits out of that, and like the Horseman powers are just fantastic. And so I was wondering if there were going to be any leaderships like that in the future, and uh, if so, what would that look like?
Mm. Well, Pagani's line here would be that we don't talk about future development, but you asked in such a way that this is very theoretical, so I think we can talk about it. Yeah, so I think when you're looking at Apocalypse, right? There was from the start when I was thinking about his design and how we would want to implement him into the game and the challenge that I would pose to our fabulous developers who would have to make it all work because the best part about being the idea guy is you don't necessarily have to figure out exactly how it'll function. You just have to have enough knowledge to know that it can function, and then you leave it to the experts to figure out. But Apocalypse is one of those characters that when you think of Apocalypse, you think of his Horseman, especially when you're looking at like that 90s era of X-Men comics, which is very much where a lot of the inspiration for the mutants, especially in Marvel Crisis Protocol, come from, that Jim Lee kind of era. So I knew when we got to Apocalypse, we had to do something with the Horseman. We had to integrate the Horseman in. And what I was hoping to avoid, because we've seen so many different iterations of these horsemen over the course of comics, everybody has their favorite horseman of X, Y, or Z. The arguments as to whether was Wolverine the best war, or was he the best death, or was Gambit the best death, like all of these different things. I really wanted to bring that ability to Marvel Crisis Protocol players and allow them to tell their own Apocalypse story, to create their own set of horsemen, because I feel it's very foundational, kind of the Marvel Crisis Protocol experience. When we set forth with the game, one of the foundational pillars was we would not have factionalization, right? You could play in thematic ways and gain benefits through leaderships, affiliations, team tactic cards, that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, we really wanted this to be your own adventure into the Marvel universe and to be able to tell your own story and to create your own supergroup. And if that meant mixing and matching characters that never even interacted with each other, which seems kind of impossible when you think about the breadth of Marvel comics and how many different characters have crossover with different characters. But if you wanted to make that team where like they had never ever in the history of Marvel comics met each other, because that was the thing you wanted to do, this game would ideally allow you to do that. And so Apocalypse was a step away from that in some ways because his kit and the way in which it worked with the Horseman cards really locked you into that affiliation, right? And we designed and balanced Apocalypse a lot around the idea that he's at his best, he's at his most powerful when he has all four horsemen with him. And so you can splash him and he does what he does, but realistically you're not getting the full bang for your buck. Or your threat as you were with Apocalypse, if you're not taking the entire team, if you're not taking the entire Servants of Apocalypse group. And that was a really fun problem to solve and to balance around. And we started actually in the idea of Crisis Protocol, where it was like, well, anyone can be any horseman. Can that work? I mean, that was the first question. And the answer was very quickly no. Because we knew once we started layering superpowers on top of these other characters, it could spiral out of control very quickly. And even if we could balance for that at the point that we were at when we were working on Apocalypse, in 6 months we were going to be bound by that for characters that we made going forward. We don't like to limit ourselves in the future because we don't know what cool ideas we might come up with or places that we might want to explore with the game based on what the meta is doing, what the community wants, what Marvel is doing with their characters. Who knows? So we decided to narrow the scope and to remove variables by making a subset of characters that could each take the Horseman abilities, and we worked through that way. I think that overall It's a very cool system, and there is potential that it could work somewhere else. It was inspired a lot by the organized play event Separation Anxiety, if you've ever been able to play that, where effectively the players, it's a 4-player free-for-all. You run around trying to collect symbiotes that have broken loose. When you collect the symbiote objective tokens, you gain a symbiote from a deck of cards. And those symbiotes give your characters these wild and crazy new superpowers and abilities. And so that was really the kind of the foundational inspiration of, we know this can work, we've done it before. We just have to take that idea and put it into a system where it can be balanced for normal standard play instead of this zany, like no holds barred event kit that is very fun, but I wouldn't call it, particularly competitively balanced by any means. And so could we do it again? I think so. I mean, I think it's something that is cool to explore. I don't really believe that we would wind up doing it a lot, though. And part of the reason is because, like I said before, the DNA of Crisis Protocol is really about you as the player being able to make as many choices when it comes to building your roster, your squad, as we can possibly give you. And the thing that you like a lot about Apocalypse, funny enough, is kind of one of those things that we do want to try to limit or avoid, which is locking players into having to take very specific subsets of these characters. It's not that it's bad, and I think in the places where it makes sense, it is very good. Like, I think with Apocalypse, it's very unique and it's interesting, and players are making that choice. But largely, our goal always is to make sure that you as the player have the most flexibility, and that when that new character comes out that you really like, right, you can instantly bring it into your collection and have all the spots that you want for it within your rosters and your squads. And Apocalypse does work against that, in that if that new character comes out but they're not a horseman, now if you also really love Apocalypse, you're kind of at this impasse where you say, okay, but this character that I want to play doesn't really work in this affiliation because they're not a horseman, and I know that if I'm taking Apocalypse, I need all the horsemen. Because Apocalypse is limited, I think that's fine, right? I think players are making those choices anyway. There's absolutely times where taking a character that you love the most, you can do it, but it doesn't really function right. It may not work within the squad composition or the whatever you're trying to do in the game. And so sometimes when you're looking at the overall team balance or the overall like squad goals, hashtag, of course, you may not be able to take everything that you want all the time. And that's just a function of the game. But I think we as developers want to be very careful about putting too many of those limits immediately on players, when our goal always is to make sure that this is a playground where you have the most sandbox possible to build whatever it is you want within what we've been able to design for the game.
Can I ask a small follow-up question here?
Go for it.
It kind of occurred to me when we were talking about developing APOC. I know we're kind of deep into the game's life cycle, deep-ish, but it's a small concern of mine. I really like his mechanics, but it seems like his affiliation list has been kind of specifically curated. So is there? I have a little concern that maybe he might start showing his age after a certain period of time. When like new characters come out, meta changes, yada yada yada. So with the disclaimer that Pagani might be listening, hypothetically, might the list have additions later down the road, or is it kind of just like, was it okay?
I mean, I think additions for sure. When a new character comes out and we feel like they fit the theme of Apocalypse and that they work within certain horseman, abilities, we can test against that. And the idea for that affiliation was that it's narrow, in that the list of characters at the time that we were testing is the list of characters that you get. But we always kind of assumed that as the game continued to grow, new additions would be added to various horsemen when they made sense. If there's a character that we work on, that we're just like, okay, we're going to do a new version of Gambit, and we really want him to be able to be Death as well, because we feel like the Gambits need to be in the Death slot, because that's a big moment in the comics. Cool. We'll just make sure that as we're working on that Gambit, he always works within whatever part of the pockets we want. Alternatively, if a character has never been a horseman before, or it's not like a huge part of their story at the time that we're making them, but we're like, yeah, we want to give that nod to the players, or we think that character would be a good inclusion to Apocalypse. We can also do that testing around it. So I wouldn't say that it's like it's set in stone, right? It's definitely like all affiliations in the game. They have the possibility and definitely the intention that at some point new additions will make their way on them as they make thematic and game sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I figured it might be a little bit more touchy and nuanced with the different writers, right? Because if memory serves correctly, I think there's like a complete balance of number of writers right now.
Currently there are, and there's overlap between two of them, but I think that's your foundation. It doesn't necessarily say that you can't like make them imbalanced, right? It was important to start that we kind of had that really solid foundation and that there was enough, one of the things that we were thinking about and really had to test well when we were doing Apocalypse is because we were going kind of against the MCP grain and we were saying, well, instead of being able to take anything you want, you can now only take this smaller subset, right? We're really factionalizing you. It became really important that we also did the math on, okay, can a player who's going to play Apocalypse and therefore their roster is going to be highly dedicated to building out the Servants of Apocalypse, and they build at every threat level that we expect them to need to be able to build at, right? And so Ben, who's the lead designer on Crisis Protocol, he spent a lot of his development effort and his conversations with playtesters at the time, not just trying to get the balance of the characters and the powers and the horseman cards right, but also on just the roster list itself. And it became a pretty intensive thing where we'd have to have conversations about, okay, well, these are the characters that are in the slots. This character isn't quite working. Can we lose them for this different character? That's kind of where Toad came into the mix as the 2-threat option. Like we're like, okay, well, we need lower threats. So can we slot in Toad? And we're like, yeah, I think he fits here and here because, well, as I always say, Crisis Protocol is heavily influenced by the 616 universe of Marvel. It is its own universe. So we do take liberties for game balance purposes or based on what's in the game at the time in order to make things function well within the overall meta balance of the rule set and things like that. So, a lot of comic readers probably in general are like, there's some weird choices on there on that Servants of Apocalypse list that have really never been or, have only a tangential connection to Apocalypse. And in those cases, they were usually chosen because they filled a necessary or an important need for that whole system to work.
So you're saying that you guys will have War Hulk eventually because I need to Hulk and Apocalypse on the table.
Yeah, maybe you never know, right? He was actually originally on the list, and he proved very problematic. So if we wind up with a Hulk in the Horsemen, it'll have to be a new Hulk. It'll have to be a different Hulk that's probably, like I said before, if we know we want to go in that direction, we can tune the character to make sure that they fit the bounds of what the Horsemen require in addition to whatever the characters. But retroactively going back and looking at the Hulks and saying, yeah, what if Hulk was War like he's been in the comic? No, not okay.
I told you. I told you.
I feel like on behalf of the podcast, I have to apologize to the entire rest of the MCP community for that question.
Solid question.
Alex, you're up.
All right. My question. We're kind of a crunchy podcast, but I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about a character you're surprised you don't see more in organized events, who that character is, and what kind of changes do you think could help them show up in organized play a little more often?
Whoa, that's a good question. And now I have to go through the entire list of 200 some characters to be like, well, what do I see very often?
Why is it not Sin?
Why is it not Sin? I think I understand. Well, there was that Dark Horse list that ran Sin at Vegas, I think it was that event, and it did quite well.
I think it was 5-1.
Yeah, but I think one of the ones that comes to mind who doesn't appear as much, and I think this is kind of an age thing, is OG Killmonger. He has incredible offensive output. He doesn't necessarily have the survivability I think the game has evolved into. So potentially looking at, some quality of life adjustments. If we even assume that he's off the balance curve, which I don't think he is. I think he does his job and he does it very well. And I'm sure he winds up in some lists. He just doesn't, having played him recently and looked at his rules recently, I was like, man, this guy slaps, but he also gets slapped. And I think that kind of like doesn't help his case as much. One of the
It's
ones
funny
that
that you
was,
mentioned Killmonger though, because we
yeah.
have like a whole segment that I have terrible luck against Killmonger. That dude will wreck me any day, and every time I put him on the table, he's a waste of time. So, just funny that you
Yeah,
mentioned that. I thought it was
I
very
could see
coincidental.
that. I think a lot of those early characters are a bit more dice dependent in that way, and that was definitely a design choice that we had at the time. We pushed against that a little bit as the meta evolved and players kind of voiced what they felt made a good character versus what didn't, which was more consistency. And obviously, competitive players are always going to want more consistency. The danger of kind of going in that way is that as you add more consistency, you add more lethality, you add more reliability, and so that can affect the game status quite a bit. And I think we've swung the pendulums always swing; they never kind of hit the middle, and so we've kind of pushed back against that, and we've started to work into that balance. But Killmonger is definitely one of those ones. Like whenever I look at his card, I'm like, man, this guy once he gets going, and it's not hard for him to get going. He's incredibly, incredibly lethal, and he's got Usurp the Throne, which is one of the few ways to access VPs and a significant number of VPs outside of the mission selection and stuff. So he's always one that, and I really like the character. I really very much enjoyed how the MCU kind of transformed him and has brought him into the modern age. So he's definitely one that I think I'm surprised I don't see as much. But I do understand kind of the reasons why. One of the ones that I don't understand the reasons why, outside of what we just talked about, which is consistency, is Thor, Prince of Asgard. Because my goodness, that man, if you followed kind of the rebalances and the adjustments, and especially as we move forward into kind of stuff, he has so much offensive output and so much control. He's locked behind typically needing a wild result, but he's one of the last remaining characters who has a throw on his builder. He has a superpower throw for characters that throws medium. Like he has a charge. He gets an extra power. He has a ranged 5 attack that costs him a power. Um, and then he has an area attack, which I know everyone's split on area attacks. If you really want to fight that battle, you can bring Pagani on because he thinks area attacks are way undervalued. I kind of see the middle ground of like, yeah, they can be really powerful, but you have to do a lot of setup, or your opponent kind of has to give it to you to be able to daze 4 characters in a round. But like, that's where his brain always goes with the dev. But for me, like Prince of Asgard, Thor is just we talk a lot internally about how surprised we are that he's not more popular, just based on the fact that like he kind of does it all and does it really well at his threat value. He's pretty durable. The only thing he doesn't have is rerolls, and the dice variability and the inconsistency is obviously very anathema if you're trying to play at a high level, because you want determined results. You don't want to, and I've certainly it's funny you mentioned how whenever you play Killmonger, he never does anything for you. I feel that way about Thor. I'll play against Thor and he will just wreck my entire team and throw them to the 4 corners of the earth. And then I will play Thor and I'll be like, here it comes. It's the 4 Asgard time. And I'm getting that 3 cost charge off and I'm going to stagger you because all I have to do is do 1 damage. And I don't think I've ever gotten a single damage on that stupid like pseudo charge to get the stagger off once.
I have an entire band of sad trumpets behind me whenever I do a Thor charge.
Yeah. And so I get like that's if you're looking at a list and stuff and you're saying yes when this guy pops off, and he's not a Carnage, right? I mean, Carnage is one of those ones where when he pops off, he ruins games in a fun way, but he's kind of the roulette wheel of MCP, which we talked about during his last during the last balance update. Is that we wanted to keep the Carnage game the same. We just kind of mitigated kind of the extremes of the highs and lows, so that he gets a chance to do it more often. But the reality is as we tested him, we were like, if you make him even slightly more reliable at what he does, he just murders the world, and that's obviously not okay.
So Carnage, obviously, like, we had to be really careful about his extreme highs and his extreme lows. But what we tried to do with the rebalance was to mitigate the extreme lows and allow him a few more opportunities to really pop off. Thor is nowhere near that amount of randomness, right? In terms of like what he does and how he can survive to do it. So he's definitely one where if you ask Pagani who the top 5 threat is, he's always going to say Thor, due to that potential. Again, I kind of get the idea that the dice fixing is one of those things where if you're looking at a tournament or whatever else, it can certainly affect your desire to play him. But I think that if players gave him more of a chance and they saw that his reliability was a bit higher than kind of the general consensus is around him, and we've put things in to build that out, right? Like you now have Jane Foster, who can provide some rerolls. You've got Heimdall, who can provide some rerolls, who's another character I'm surprised doesn't turn up quite as much, especially with his ability to just slide to reroll any roll, which is crazy good. But of course, he has to generate the power and be able in a position to do that and stuff. So I think there's a lot of characters, right? And ideally, what we're hoping for all the time is that every character has a place, and largely every character can succeed with proper support, with a good skilled player, and with a little bit of dice luck, right? And where I think we run into more trouble is when those characters that consistently do the thing without, they either ignore the dice or they're slightly overtuned or those kinds of things. That's where we have to come in and really look at the balance of things and move it back. But I think Killmonger and Thor, based on that question, just in general, would be my 2 that I'd pick right off the bat.
I have a follow-up question to that.
Please do.
So you mentioned the power of area attacks. So did you guys rebalance the crisis with the area attacks and stuff like that in mind, like to force people to spread out so that they don't get affected by area attacks as easily?
Not specifically for area attacks. The crisis adjustments and kind of pushing away from the center or scrum was really done in order to address in some small ways, not to completely fix, but obviously with an eye to the idea that higher threat, small team high threats, right? The kaijus, as the community calls them, they really excel at those middle scrums, right? Because if you all have to come to a central point, they can obviously reach out and smash you much easier, and it becomes less of a liability to have fewer activations because you can affect all of your threat before your opponent affects their threat. If you think about like when Hulk goes, if he goes first in a round, you've effectively activated 2 3-threat models before your opponent even gets to go. And that's a very simplified way of thinking about how those higher threat miniatures like impact those characters, impact stuff and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, moving away from kind of those clustered centered objectives was in part to help the wider teams have more opportunity for success and not be forced into situations where they can kind of get run over by those higher threat characters and those smaller teams. Obviously, it also affects area attacks in certain ways, but area attacks weren't really blowing up the meta anyway, primarily because even when, a lot of that action was happening more centrally, and I think you could see more opportunity to see the area attacks hit like Pagani kind of analyzes them as, where that original Thor area attack I think was cost 7 before it got dropped. It was crazy high. You weren't seeing those anyway, and part of that is that a lot of those area attacks they just roll dice. So as a spender, they're not throwing characters. They just have this chance to impact several characters in the opposing team. And, largely what we saw, especially now that we've adjusted those things down, is that the player base in general doesn't really value that over everything else you can do with your power. So some of that initial analysis and those fears were dialed back or proven to be largely untrue based on the play patterns of players. And so we brought those down. And obviously we wouldn't have done that and spread out the crisis at the same time if we thought that that was a significant problem likely. But there's less effectiveness in those things now because the crises are slightly more spread out. But the primary motivation was to try to provide a little bit more flexibility and freedom for wider teams to be able to do what they want to do and have their advantages over a lower activation count list.
All right, JP, you are up.
All right. So a lot of these questions kind of come from conversations or curiosities or maybe even expectations that we might have about the game. And like this next one is definitely one that kind of came up when the new Guardians box dropped with Nova and Yondu. I know as like a community, we were kind of expecting like one of them maybe to have a leadership. So especially considering that Guardians only had one leader or only have one leader. So my question, I guess, is how does AMG approach leadership distribution across affiliations? And how do you see the leadership roles evolving over time?
Yeah, good question. So for the most part, the way in which we view leadership spread across affiliations is that every affiliation has to have a leadership. And then from there, it really comes down to the characters that we're targeting to put into the game. And if they have a thematic or narrative reason to be a leader. We don't particularly concern ourselves with the idea that every affiliation has to have 2 or 3 leaderships available to it. Similar to the idea that we don't necessarily go into every affiliation expecting that we're going to wind up adding characters within a certain time span. And humans are a great example of this, right? They were near the front of the game in the first year or so, and then they didn't really get reinforcements until last year. So it's like a 4-year spread between the affiliation really seeing dedicated Inhumans. I think we added a couple of things like Beast got in there, and a couple others. Quicksilver, I think, got into the Inhumans, and those kinds of things. So there are some that got added, but really from a concerted, like, we're going to expand this affiliation and add characters that are missing from it. That happened on its own timeline. And again, this comes down to kind of what I do in my role for the product planning and strategy, is that we're having conversations with Marvel. We're looking at where we need to go with the game. We're looking at kind of like sales and all these different things that then come back to, okay, this is where we think we can target these characters. This is where it makes sense. We're trying to align with what our partners at Marvel are doing. We're also trying to do what's going to be critical for the game, and then also what we need to do just from a cohesive product standpoint. And for the most part, our goal is typically to see the game get wider rather than deeper. So if we have the opportunity to say, because we can only make so much, there's only so much manufacturing and production bandwidth, and there's only so many products that can go on a shelf per month and that kind of stuff. So if we come down to the point where it's like, okay, we can either do a new affiliation with characters, we can either do a Midnight Suns, or we could add a new leadership to Guardians, more than likely we'll add Midnight Sun, because making the game wider lets us touch more of the Marvel universe, which makes the game, more appealing to a broader audience and makes the game feel more rich and robust than necessarily doubling down and going back into something that's already established, especially if, we're looking at things where it's like, okay, it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other in terms of what the tenor and tone and excitement around these characters might be. So there's kind of that, but the way in which we do development and design in general is always theme first, and then we build from there. So we're not necessarily looking at the game as a set of numbers and balance points. Instead, what we're trying to do is create the most robust and exciting Marvel experience we possibly can. And what that means is that we're going to look for ways in which we think we're going to heighten that excitement and that enjoyment of the setting. And then we're going to apply rules to make that function within. So, for instance, when we're looking at adding a new character like a Yondu or a Nova, we might have the conversation of, okay, at one point, this character led this team. you know? And so we could give this character leadership. And that might be the way in which we decide to approach it. With Nova and Yondu and the versions that we're doing, neither of those really made sense as Guardians leaders. They hadn't really taken on that role in terms of the versions of the characters we were doing. And we didn't really feel like slapping a leadership on them, therefore would make thematic sense and fit within what we wanted to do with the characters. There's also a question of space. So, like there's only so much room on the card. And therefore, we also have to be like, okay, well, we could add it. Sometimes if we're at a 50-50, we're like, we could add it, but what do we lose to get the leadership? And is that worth it? Does that make the character feel more like the character? Or does it make the character feel less? Like, what's the coolest version of the character we can make? And so those are also the conversations that we have. When it comes to like distribution and that kind of thing, I think, we are at an inflection point where there are some really interesting conversations to be had around your kind of large affiliations versus your small affiliations. So like Avengers, Cabal, kind of the catch-all groups that everybody has been a part of. From a thematic standpoint, we often will add characters when they make sense. Like I mentioned before, we heavily base ourselves in 616, but we are not 616. So there's absolutely characters that appear in affiliations where players are like, well, that person was barely a part of it, or this person was a part of it, but they're not in it. Like, why? Sometimes the answer is balance. Sometimes the answer is other things. But usually we're making those decisions for the health of the game at that point because we feel like we're not losing anything from the theme of the character. Or that's just not the version of the character that we believe was joining that team at the time. So there's a lot of considerations that go into that. And really, I think where we kind of go is, and we've mentioned this before in previous development casts, but when we say, okay, we're going to add a new affiliation, we're going to add A-Force, or we're going to add Midnight Suns, or we're going to add Inhumans to the game, what we do during development and playtest is we say, we have to assume that when we release this, there may never be another release for it. So it needs to stand on its own with what we provide the players and be a healthy and functional choice for the breadth and life of the game. Now, the reality is that we plan to go back to all of these affiliations and add more characters because our goal ultimately is to do every version of every Marvel character that's ever existed. But obviously, again, we only have a limited amount of bandwidth in which to do that. So we have to kind of assume that unless something's on the schedule and we're going to immediately follow this up with something else. And again, like I said, the philosophy is to go wide, not necessarily go deep, that there could be 4 years where the Inhumans are just this group of Inhumans. And are we like confident as we can be, that the affiliation that we're providing will be able to stand the test of time, do its unique and interesting thing, have its powerful and interesting team tactic cards, and continue to be able to compete or be a viable and interesting choice for players as new things roll in and as these other things go. And we're benefited by the fact that, again, going back to the first question about the Apocalypse leadership, is that splash characters exist. So every new character adds life into an affiliation because it can be brought in along with, the core group, the 3 or 4 characters that you have to take depending on how wide your squad is, to unlock that affiliation. So, we have that benefit as well, which is really nice because it means that since the vast majority of leaderships, especially all the ones in the characters, are not affiliation specific, outside of Apocalypse, which is a very unique thing, you can benefit. Every splash character gets the benefit from those leaderships. So it's an interesting like question, and it's definitely one of those ones that we have conversations about. Overall, we don't design from an affiliation first standpoint. We don't necessarily logistically plan from an affiliation first standpoint. We do know, from that 5-year plan that in 2 years we're going to be getting to these characters, which we know will go into this affiliation. What they will add, we won't know until we start doing the design briefs, but we do kind of know where those affiliations will grow. And we do try to plan, a nice little bump for each of them. So we had the Midnight Suns with Elsa and the Marvel Monsters. That kind of expanded the Midnight Suns. We had the Inhumans, the new Inhumans that came in, that kind of thing. When an affiliation gets a new leadership, it's usually based on the fact that there's an interesting chance to do a new leader for that affiliation that has been a leader of that affiliation in the comics, or we're kind of merging a couple of different themes from the comics together. Like, for example, the Midnight Suns, Elsa's leadership is bucketed under the Midnight Suns, but it's kind of a different comic run, but they kind of all fit within the same theme. So we decided to kind of combine those, and there's a lot of overlap between those characters, that kind of thing. Yeah, so it's one of those things where I don't think that it negatively, at least as far as our analysis goes, it doesn't necessarily negatively impact the game balance, because again, you have that freedom and flexibility to mix and match characters across all these different affiliations and all that stuff. If it was a factionalized game, I think it'd be a much more significant concern, where you were like, well, you have your Avengers and its list is this big, and you can only take Avengers if you play Avengers. And then you have Midnight Suns and its list is this big, right? We'd have to have a lot more parity in between the affiliations to make sure that internal balance existed. But one of the great things about the way in which Crisis Protocol is constructed to be kind of a free-for-all, take whichever characters you want, we don't have to worry about imbalances as much within that. Now, there's absolutely still power, like there's power in having a wider list or a larger list, because then you have more chances to make your core 3 or 4 or whatever that number winds up being the best of those characters, and you rely less on splash. But that also plays back into thematics and things like that. So, at the end of the day, leaderships usually come down to, does it make sense for the character thematically? And then we will add it, and we will go from there. The only real one that we do have consideration and talks about from time to time that are intentional development adds, although they are still based in theme, are like the team tactic leaderships that get added onto a character that was previously released. So, for example, Medusa, in that Inhumans box, she got a new leadership card that she can utilize as a team tactic card. That one came because our original plan was that we would do a different version of Medusa at some point, and that she would have a leadership to kind of reflect her moment in that story. But for various reasons, those plans didn't come to fruition. So we had an opportunity to kind of go back and say, okay, well, let's give a nod to this. Let's give an additional, like, basically tool in the team tactic card box that allows players to see that moment of Medusa taking over leadership of the Inhumans. There's also times where, for example, like with Weapon X, our intention from the design standpoint is not to create a new affiliation, but as we go through playtest and playing, and we have internal conversations about the theme and stuff, we're like, wouldn't it be cool if players who wanted to could say, play Weapon X, and we'll just bucket these characters together, and it takes this opportunity cost of the team tactic cards, but we can do something really cool with that. Dracula's leadership is similar to that. The Hellfire Club, which obviously started as kind of like a catch-all, and then we had to rebalance based on kind of how it was impacting the game, is another one like that, where we basically said, well, we're not going to do a Hellfire Club affiliation at the time because we didn't really have the characters that would make a thematic 616 influenced Hellfire Club. So we'll just give a nod to the fact that a lot of the playtesters were like, but Emma Frost, Hellfire Club, she should be able to do this, and that. And so we solved that through the team tactic card. And then, of course, had to go back as we learned hard lessons about how that impacted everything and do the adjustments. So now it is an affiliation. So those things also come like out of the woodwork, right? Convocation was another one that was similar. They were kind of the first to have no leader, but they had a leadership card. That kind of unlocked a new design space where we could come in and add these things if we wanted to maybe buoy or boost, or just add an optional, thematic mechanic for players who wanted to do that. And some of those we don't expect in team tactic cards in general. There are some that we expect players will use a lot of. There are some that we expect are just for fun, and you might use them because you want to see if you can do it. Kraven's Last Hunt kind of being the perfect example of that, Fearful Symmetry, where it's like you take that card because you're playing with your buddy and you're just like, I'm gonna turn my Kraven into Spider-Man. It's gonna happen. This game, that's the only thing I care about. Winning, losing doesn't matter. Kraven's becoming Spider-Man. And that's a moment, and it's exciting. And then 99% of the time you never play that card because it's not a very good card. It's just a fun, zany card. That's totally okay, because there's a bunch of other cards that you can take instead.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up the leadership tactics cards because it kind of intersects, I believe, with one of Patrick's questions. But before we segue into that, when you were talking about it, it sparked kind of an interesting question in my head as a follow-up. So when you were talking about Medusa and saying like you had ideas later after she was released, but you decided you weren't going to do a new version of her, at least at this time, so you just wanted to kind of put out a new leadership for Inhumans. How do you decide to do that iteration of like a rework as opposed to what you guys did with Daredevil, where you released a new character card and attached the leadership to his card so that he doesn't have an opportunity cost of a tactics card?
So Daredevil was an interesting one in that, he was a character that was off the balance curve, right? He wasn't really hitting where we would want a character even at the lower end of the spectrum to hit. And as we kind of dug into the process of saying, how do we get him back on the curve? What would we change? How would we adjust this and everything? We had a chance, effectively, to add a leadership that reflected the, his kind of MCU more so role as a leader within the Defenders, and have that be additive to his kit, and also additive to the Defenders affiliation, which in general was struggling a little bit within the overall balance of the affiliations, because several of its characters were like mid on the curve, right? They didn't really have anything that was pushing them over. So it was kind of it was a 2-for-1 in that we got to adjust a character that was not hitting where we wanted him to. And we were able to kind of breathe new life into an affiliation that was starting to see a little wear and tear and struggle a bit. And of course, when you can do that, when all the stars align and you get to kind of get double fun out of your hard work, it's a great time to do it. With Medusa, we didn't really feel like she needed the leadership. It was just something that we kind of wanted to include within that affiliation because she does take command of the Inhumans quite a bit. But within that box, right, she already has, or they already had new leaders coming out. They had Maximus and those kinds of things. So we were just kind of like, well, why don't we just add this as an option for players who really want Medusa to be represented as her role? When Black Bolt goes off and runs a bar or whatever he does, he always like abdicates the throne for a year or two, and then he comes back and somehow gets right back into the king spot because she's like, whatever, man. But that's kind of the difference, right? It comes down to Daredevil was a unique case in that we were rebalancing the character in general as part of our relook and rebalance. And we also had this same situation where when looking at that character, we were also looking at the affiliations he was in and saying, well, Defenders could probably use a bit of an additional lift. And by adding a new leadership, that could really do that. When we were rebalancing Medusa way back, when she got her balance pass, she was getting tuned down, so not getting tuned up, because she was overperforming the curve. So the idea of adding like a leadership, even if it had fit on her card, which I don't think it would have fit anyway, because her card is quite full, which again goes back to another consideration, is just physical space on the stat card. But, at the time, the Inhumans weren't, the game was still pretty young, because I think she was in the first balance pass we did. And like the Inhumans affiliation we felt was functioning as fine as all of the other affiliations were. And we were mostly concerned with just adjusting her to get back onto the curve because she was breaking it on the top end. Whereas Daredevil was kind of too low. He was falling off the curve in terms of his play patterns and where we wanted him to be.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So taking a little different track, some of the rebalances we've seen have been for really iconic characters like Cyclops and Wolverine and most recently Gambit. How important is it that the fan favorite, the really iconic characters, are characters that are frequently played, are characters that get pulled out more often than some of the less well-known characters?
I mean, I think when you're talking about what attracts a person to Marvel Crisis Protocol, it is those characters that they know and love. And for the most part, the characters that the vast majority of players know and love are the icons that, you're typically that pass the mom test. So can your mom name them? Does she recognize them? Those are the characters that probably have the most sauce or juice, as it were. As much as, I might love a Dr. Voodoo, I'm fully aware of the fact that there's only a subset of Marvel fans that are going to immediately recognize that character. And most players are probably not going to jump into the game because Dr. Voodoo's in it. So with that in mind, right, the iconic characters, your headliners, your A-listers, they do get a bit more of a look. And we necessarily don't want them to be the top end of the curve every time, because that just doesn't work. Now you're talking about power creep, because there's only going to be so many best things. We do, of course, try to keep them in the middle of the curve. Daredevil's like a good example. He's a character that I think is probably B plus or A minus. For the most part, the Disney Plus and the Netflix shows, I think, elevated him quite a bit. And of course, he had a Fox movie, it was Fox that did the movie with Affleck and stuff, which I liked, but other people have different opinions on, so whatever. But so I think if you go back and you look at his original card, you'd be like, was he completely off the curve, or was he just at the bottom of the curve? And there's an argument to be made either way. But when you're talking about a character like Daredevil, you don't want him to be near the bottom of the curve. You want him to be like healthy middle to maybe a little bit above. Like your Cyclopses, your Gambits, your Spider-Mans, your Wolverines, your Avengers, like your iconic Avengers. We want those characters to feel very good and for players to see success when they put them on the table. It doesn't mean that they have to be winning world championships in every list, but we do have, I think, kind of a responsibility in some ways to make sure that Marvel's most popular characters also have a popularity within the game. The last thing you want is for Spider-Man to be the worst character in your Marvel game, right? It's just, that's not a good look, and it's going to lead to a lot of people being disappointed. However, with all that said, while we may kind of scrutinize those characters a bit more and potentially give them a little bit more consideration when we're coming around to the balance passes, at the end of the day, our goal as developers and as game creators is to make sure the game itself is as healthy and fun and robust as possible. So we're not going to, as much as we may say, well, it's important for Spider-Man to be a really strong pick, we're not going to go in and say, well, let's just break everything to make sure that Spider-Man is the best character that possibly can be. And every time Spider-Man gets overshadowed, we'll just push him more. We feel that as long as a character is within the balance curve, which we try to keep fairly tight so that there's not a lot of distance between the top end and the bottom end, we're doing our jobs well. And that's really what we focus on primarily. So, whether that's going in and adjusting a Viper, or it's adjusting a Gambit, or it's adjusting a Colossus, or it's adjusting a Spider-Man or a Wolverine or whatever, we're always doing that with the intention of not necessarily making one character the best, but instead making sure that the holistic view of the game is one that, whether you like the A-listers for Marvel or you like the super deep cuts for Marvel, you're going to be able to come to the game, put together your roster, and feel like your player skill and a little bit of dice luck is what's going to carry you to victory, not necessarily your squad composition or your roster composition. There's definitely that when you talk about like what's the mix of strategy, skill, luck, whatever, right? We kind of want luck to be 30% of the game. You want skill to be the majority of the game. And then you want like turn zero stuff, which is kind of player skill, but different, right? Because I think games are most fun when you're solving them in the moment, not when you're just like, I've made my machine, and as long as you don't interrupt the machine and it runs perfectly, I already know I'm going to win, right? We don't want things to be predetermined. We want surprises, and we want randomness, and we want players to have to think on their feet and perform good tactics and adapt to situations. And that exists in a lot of games, but there's definitely like that question of how much does turn 0 matter versus how much does actual play matter versus how much does randomness matter. And so that's part of the reason why we built the game to have the dice system that it did, is that we were coming from games in a time at which you could kind of reliably just ignore randomness in a lot of tabletop miniatures games, because the push had become so much that like, well, we just want to make sure, like, outside of extremes, like I roll 1s or I roll 6s, for the most part, I know exactly what my army or my unit will do when I have it do its actions, because I can kind of mathematically figure out exactly what will happen and exactly the bonuses and control everything down to the letter. We wanted to add more of that, like, oh, this didn't go right. Now what do I do, right? More of that problem solving in the moment and less predeterministic outcomes. So we intentionally tried to design a dice system that's very hard to math out in play, right? So the exploding crits, the fails, the rerolls, the modifications, how wilds interact, the different abilities that might multiply results of wilds, that take away crits, all of these things. It's all done intentionally with the idea that, you know, for the vast majority of players, you can't calculate it so fast in your head that even if you're a very talented and skilled player and understand the outcomes quite well, you're still going to be like, but it could absolutely go wrong. Let's see what happens, right? The idea that you could be like, well, we don't need to roll dice for this because we already know that barring a 0.1% chance, it's going to do exactly what it's going to do. We were just like, that's not super fun. You know, it doesn't tell a story. It doesn't lead to those highs and lows that make these games so memorable. And it really doesn't cause you to interact as much as we wanted with your opponent. We wanted to see a lot of player interaction and a lot of like back and forth, because, you know, at the end of the day, you are playing a game on a tabletop, but you're playing a game with another person.
Right.
And the magic of these games is when you're making that connection across the table with your opponent and you're having this shared experience and you're connecting in this kind of like human way that is beyond the physical, and you walk away from that table with these great stories, these great moments, the dopamine hits, the lows, the highs, all of that good stuff. So that was all kind of like cooked into. So long tangent concluded. We do absolutely want to make sure that the iconic characters feel great to play, but we apply that same mentality to all of the characters. So, you know, again, we're trying to make a holistic Marvel Universe game that is exciting no matter who your favorite character is, that you feel like you can come in and have all the player choices you want. And what stops you from being able to do that is, again, when things break the curve. If something is completely off the curve, you're like, well, no matter how skilled I am, there's no way that I can really make this work. And if something is way too far off the curve, then it's like, well, no matter how skilled I am, I can't beat that. Right. And I think we've seen those situations come up where we've kind of misstepped with like Malekith and Cosmic Ghost Rider, are two that are like more recent, and kind of the wide teams versus the small teams, which we talked about with the center objective thing and that kind of the movement away from that. There are instances where, like, whenever something is robbing players of their choice, and I'm going to use the term that the community loves to use all the time. And by community, I mean like gaming community, not just the MCP community. But something that you see get brought up a lot in comments is player agency. And depending on who's saying the word, it has a radically different definition, which is why we always giggle about it in the office, because we're like, what does that mean? And depending on the person and the context, it can mean wildly different things. But for us, player agency simply means that you as a player get to make choices, and that those choices matter, right? And so that's what we're always focused on. Does the player get to make choices? Do those choices matter? Do those choices force their opponent to make decisions that also matter? And does that create a fun and interactive game experience? And as long as we can do that, we're pretty happy with where we're at.
All right. Thank you. David, you're up.
You guys like stole all my thunder for my questions. So now my fellow wizards out there are probably going to hate me for asking this and love me for asking it at the same time. So I got two questions.
Okay.
One, why is Convocations leadership not counted in your 5 as a tactics card compared to all of the other leaderships? And why is Wanda and Loki not in Convocation? And how do you go
All
about
right.
deciding whether or not those characters make it in or not?
I can answer both of those. So the first one, why is Convocation's leadership not counted against your cards? And the reason for that is that Convocation and the affiliation in general was created around that entire concept. So it is baked into their affiliation identity. And importantly, it is something that we really want to keep unique to them. So they've been balanced around that fact, whereas some of the other affiliations and the leadership cards have not been. But it's also one of those like unique things that really marks them out as different and special, similar to the Horsemen of Apocalypse and how that stuff works. Like we already talked about, maybe someday in the future we see that concept come back. But for now, it is like what marks Apocalypse and his group to be radically different or interesting. The Convocation leadership being free and the fact that it's double-sided and you can flip-flop it and all of that stuff. It was designed at the very start of our discussions and our exploration into those characters and that affiliation as one of the things that would just make them stand out as wizards, right? As mystic users within the Marvel Universe. And so it was very intentional. Why other affiliations don't get that benefit? One, it would rob Convocation of its uniqueness, one of its unique defining traits that we purposely baked in. And two, most of those tactic cards are designed in a way that the opportunity cost is baked into their power level. So again, this all comes back to intention and like what we're designing for and all of this stuff. Convocation is balanced around the idea that that card is free. And that affiliation requires a high number of their, or at least a good amount of their multitudinous magic relics, which are indicated by team tactic cards, to really do what they do well. And so, that also came into the fact of like, well, if we make this card this way, then it won't work for that. But at the end of the day, when we initially started stuff, the idea was presented that, okay, they're not going to have a leader. They are going to be an affiliation. They're going to have this card. From there, once we realized that the team tactic card affiliate, like leadership thing worked, like, oh, we can apply this to some other things, but we don't want to step on Convocation's toes. So they're kind of always going to count against your team tactic card count. However, because of that, we're typically able to do way more powerful leadership effects because of the opportunity cost required around them. This is mostly true for the ones that are affiliation locked, not like your Draculas. Obviously, when we make a really powerful affiliation leadership that is not an affiliation per se, looking at you, Hellfire Club, it can cause a lot of problems. And so we've learned from that misstep as well. And that's why Hellfire Club kind of got a pseudo affiliation list around it in order to keep the card mostly the same, although the card also had some power level that got tamped down. But, if you look at, say, the Medusa leadership, you look at the Corvus Glaive leadership, you look at some of the others, the Weapon X leadership, those leaderships on those team tactic cards are typically a lot more pushed than any of the leaderships that you see coming out, especially in the modern age. There's some arguments that, like, original Captain America's leadership is still one of the best leaderships in the game, even though he might not necessarily be one of the best characters in the game. So there's always going to be a spectrum. But the mindset behind that, and I think this is where the conversation is always interesting to us internally, to give you kind of a view behind the scenes and what we talk about when we see player feedback on them or we see player discussion about them, is it's like, well, I would never waste a team tactic card on a leadership. I would rather take another team tactic card. And then the thought process goes, okay, but if I told you that you could take a team tactic card that you could literally play every turn and gain the effect, it just went back to your hand and it was free and you could play it every turn, wouldn't you say that was like the best team tactic card that was ever made? And that's what those team tactic card leaderships are. They're a team tactic card that, depending on the leadership, right? Not all of them work every turn. Some of them only work per round or whatever. But they're effectively team tactic cards that get played multiple times throughout a game. So exponentially, their effect is way larger for the most part than the vast majority of other team tactic cards. Now there are some that kind of combat with that, but for the sake of argument, that's kind of how we look at them. And so that's also how they kind of get balanced around. So yeah, you're taking an opportunity cost of losing that card, but the effects on those cards compared to other team tactic cards, a lot of other team tactic cards are like way more powerful and way more persistent. So, for us, it's like, okay, well, I get it. It feels like it should be free, right? And I think that's where a lot of the psychology comes in. But leaderships are free. They're just on the characters. And then, of course, I always kind of lament the fact that we did the thing with Convocation where we made their card free because there's precedent where people are like, but Convocation. And it's like, yes, but that is a special thing that was engineered just for them. It was never meant to be applied anywhere else. And agree with it or don't. I'm just trying to give you some of like the insight from behind the scenes. I think, it's subjective, right? All arguments are valid in a certain way. Could we make all leadership cards free? Yes. Would we have to change the power level of those leadership cards? More than likely, right? In the vast majority of cases, I think that would absolutely kind of be the case. So that's the answer to that question. I forget the second part of the question. Remind me.
Why is Wanda and Loki not in Convocation?
That's it. Okay, that answer is easy. Balance is really the answer. So when Convocation was getting tested, both Wanda and Loki were included. That is part of the reason why Loki is skulking around the bar with no doors, despite the fact that he is not in the Convocation, because the art brief was developed when we had the initial list. However, at the time, and I think this kind of goes back to our discussion about, affiliations in general, their distribution, are they kind of living? Will we add new things to the Apocalypse leadership or affiliation, yada, 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 right? At the time, when Convocation was getting heavily tested and balanced, those two characters were highly problematic within the affiliation and what it could do. Wanda's offensive output was kind of peak at that time, especially given how a lot of the defensive tech and everything else kind of worked out. And she was blowing out games with the Convocation. So we made the decision to remove her because we couldn't affect her rules. And there really wasn't a way for us to balance around the outsized impact she was having. So we pulled her. Loki he wasn't necessarily blowing out games, but he was also proving problematic within the affiliation. And so we decided to drop him as well, because the testing showed that those two were kind of having an outside impact within what we felt was the appropriate game balance and everything that we wanted out of that affiliation. Loki was pushing out some of the newer characters that we really wanted to give a space to. And since he obviously had a home already, it was like, well, he doesn't need to be there. I think that him existing, had we not removed him, would have been fine, but he did step on some toes. And what we saw consistently with feedback was like, well, but I would just take Loki over X, Y, or Z, like over Ancient One, over Mordo. There we go. Almost slipped into some Tolkien there.
He is a Baron after all.
That's true. That's true. And so we made the decision to remove Loki to give space to breathe for the newer characters to live within their home affiliation, and leave Loki within his affiliations that already existed and he was doing well in. So that's the answer there. It was all balance.
So you're saying there's a chance?
There is, right? I mean, if we went back and we kind of relooked at the Convocation now and where, Wanda has somewhat fallen off from where she used to be at the top, which is kind of the natural evolution of a lot of living games, is that what's at the peak one day might not be there in a year because other things come in or players change or the crises change. A lot of different levers. Could she wind up back in there and be okay now? It's very possible, right? We haven't really had discussions about it or done any testing on it, so I couldn't say with surety. But absolutely, there's a chance that we could see that happen and we could see that go. So, but yeah, so that's the reasoning as to why they didn't make the cut in the first place. One was really breaking balance and kind of the gaming experience, and the other one was being a bully and pushing the characters that we wanted to see represented in the affiliation out.
I will say that does seem a little on suit or on brand for Loki being a bully and pushing people out, though.
He's a mischievous fellow for sure.
You're up.
All right. My last question is kind of the approach on how you guys work with unaffiliated tactics cards, whether they're character specific or if they're just readily available for everybody. What's kind of the thought process on that, and kind of the final decisions on whether a tactics card can be used freely or if it's tied to a character?
So tactic cards have gone through a pretty radical evolution just from our understanding and approach as a development team. When we started working on Crisis Protocol at the beginning, we came upon the idea of putting in the team tactic cards to kind of represent these big cinematic moments, these team ups. Really thinking about like Marvel Ultimate Alliances and things, like when you see that refractor like shield move, and you just go, oh, that's awesome. We get to see these characters like interact. And then once we kind of decided we wanted those in the game, we built a system around it that said, okay, well, you get X number to use during play. And, that number kind of shifted and shook a little bit, but it wound up being 5. And of course, originally you could bring 8 in your roster because that was just the arbitrary number we picked. And that's what we tested around. And what happened is that because there's this small subset of characters when you start the game, you say, well, the problem we have is that you can take 5, but you might be playing with 4 characters. So we're going to need some generics. Like players are going to need an open field to be able to pull in to fill out these requirements that we've now built. Because you have to take 8 in your roster and you have to take 5 in a game. And if they're all character specific or they're all team up specific, especially like you look at those original team tactic cards, the vast majority of them required to play 2 characters or more to play. There were only a couple that were like 1 character gets to do this, because the original intent was these are team ups. These are literally characters. It's not just the team as the squad doing things together. It was like, this is very specifically this character and this character are joining forces to do this thing, video game combo style on the tabletop. So we had to create a bunch of generics. So we did that. We went through and we said, okay, well, what are going to be compelling options that are going to be universally applicable no matter what team or what style of game you're playing, And of course, what happened was, and maybe we should have seen this coming, but there was a lot going on at the time, that those universal ones that were generic were obviously far more useful than the more specific and maybe more flashy, more thematic team up cards for the characters that we originally built the whole system for. And as the game kind of matured throughout the first year and the second year of its lifespan, we identified that we had kind of developed ourselves into a bad spot, because the generic abilities, your patch ups, your drop offs, your whatever, these things were pushing out any card that we could make, because no matter how cool we made Lethal Protector, it was never going to make the cut, because Lethal Protector isn't as ubiquitous as just healing a character for 3, right? There's no consideration. Like no player of any type is going to be like, that one's better. Be like, that one's cooler, but this one's better.
The protector doesn't start with all you got.
That's true. All you got is another one. Yeah. So we kind of like, we effectively had to sit down and we said, okay, we have to reimagine what we want out of these team tactic cards. And, they had become, I think the other thing that was, and we've talked about this maybe once or twice before, but we didn't understand how important the team tactic cards would become to the game meta. For us, when we were designing them, we were like, oh, these are cool and they do neat things, but honestly, you don't need them. They were just like the cherry on top. They weren't the chocolate scoop in the banana split. And that was kind of it's just one of those fun development things where we always talk about, you make a thing, you send it out into the wild, and then people do things you don't expect with it. And from our standpoint, like when we were playing, we'd play like 2 or 3 team tactic cards, but typically we'd end games with 1 one or more left over that we're just like, yeah, we never had a chance to play it. Not a big deal. Game went fine. It was perfect as is. I wouldn't change anything. And the player base kind of adopted this tactic and strategy behind utilizing really efficiently what the team tactic cards brought. They became super important. It became kind of a really big linchpin to roster building and construction. And now we have these generics that are pushing everything else out. And we want to continue to make cool team tactic cards. We want to continue to explore this space, but like these initial generics that we made are just so good that no matter what we do, we can't beat them. So that's where the banned and restricted list came in. We started to cull those. And then the development philosophy behind team tactic cards changed quite dramatically. And so what you'll see now, 6 years later, is you see very few generics. And the reason that you don't see very many generics, and by generics, I mean they're not attached to a character, they're not attached to an affiliation, right? They're just freebies, is because we learned from hard experience that generics, they push out everything. So Brace for Impact is one of the few generics that I think was built into the game for a very specific reason, and it continues to uphold that reason. And what Brace does is it makes throws okay, because the game is founded. One of the foundational pillars of the game is terrain throws. Terrain throws are highly impactful, but only certain characters get access to them. So what's the counterplay to throws? And the answer to that is Brace. And that's why Brace is kind of like everyone's like, but everyone takes it. Yeah, they're supposed to. Like literally, when we made that card, we said to ourselves, everyone will take Brace. And that is intended, right? It is the defense against the dark arts that you need in order to make the game what we wanted the game to be. So, there are a few generics like Brace, I think is kind of the last one that probably would still be made to this day if it didn't exist, because it needs to exist. It's a counterbalance to a thing. And we want every character, we want that to be ubiquitous, because if you made a Brace for every character, you're like, well, but that's not doing anything because it's going to eat up your whole hand. And then what happens when that character doesn't take collision damage? I wasted that card. So generics are tricky, and we've mostly moved away from a design philosophy from doing generics, unless they're really kind of niche or like unique. Like Versatile Strategy is a generic that lets you swap a leadership, but there's a pretty high opportunity cost to that. The generics that do remain, they're almost always on the restricted list. So effectively, we've now put an opportunity cost on them because they are very easy to use and very powerful because of that effectiveness and kind of that universal appeal. And instead, what we've done is we've really moved into the team tactic cards being more about enhancing characters' abilities to do really cool once per game things, or going back to that idea of like, if you take these two characters and you use them together, you're going to be able to do this other cool thing that doesn't exist. And so I talked a lot about how, like, on Medusa's card, there's not really room for leadership, and space on a tactic card or on a stat card is pretty premium, and we have to think about that. Doing the team tactic cards as kind of the character's one-shot abilities, these bigger, badder things, gives us more room to do ideas that we had that we were like, oh, this is really cool, but it really doesn't come up that often. Great, let's just push it a bit more and make this team tactic card. And then, of course, team tactic cards also provide affiliations the identity that they need to be intriguing choices. And they go on top of the leadership. So kind of talking about, going back earlier in the conversation about like how we view affiliations and leaderships, a single leadership might be fine forever, but what we do want to do is we want to try to bring an influx of new team tactic cards for that affiliation when we bring new characters out, because those can have just as much impact as bringing in a new leader. Especially if the leader, like for Guardians, right? Like that leadership, winging it is incredibly powerful. So can we compete with that with a different character and a different leadership? Maybe, maybe not. But adding new Guardians affiliated tactic cards has kept that whole affiliation feeling fresh and exciting, allowing for different strategies and different expressions, despite the fact that they might still always be taking Star-Lord and those types of things. So that's kind of the long road of team tactic cards and where we're at now and kind of how we view those things. For the most part, we've learned generics are not particularly healthy for the overall ecosystem of the game. There are instances, if they're very niche or limited in terms of their effect or what they're trying to counterbalance, that they can be okay. But largely what we want to do is we want to build out affiliation some kind of limiter, right? Whether it's affiliation, character specific, or both. And then we try to tune the card around those limitations. So a very powerful card, typically it's limited to affiliation and character. Middle of the ground cards are usually affiliation or character. Sometimes really powerful cards are just affiliation, but they'll have like a global impact rather than a very specific impact, those kinds of things. There are a lot of different dials we can turn with that.
All right, JP, you're up.
All right. Well, Will, your answers have been so articulate and fleshed out that our second questions have kind of been catching strays. So I'm going to try to retool this one. You had kind of touched on it at a few different points in the conversation. First, when you were talking about Hulk having an activation on an EMAP at the start of the round, and like just schooling the planet, or Thor being like a holdover of an older type an older type of developed character where they would have a superpower character throw. Well, and then you touched on it again with the when you were talking about the misstep with Malekith and CGR. So this kind of has to do with the higher threat characters. And I did want to hear you kind of. I'm curious what more you have to say on it. How have you? I'm going to retool it a little bit. How have you learned from the mistakes with some of these characters that have come out and ended up being overpowered in terms of developing future, like let's say 6th threat or higher characters? I know we've seen a drop off of superpower character throws, and we've also seen a keyword of peerless. But I'm curious what else is going into developing characters moving forward, learning from past mistakes.
So I think there's an interesting track of sorry, 1 second. The dogs are going crazy. Okay. So past mistakes and everything. The track or the road to kind of, I think, where we wound up with Malekith and CGR is kind of baked into when we started designing and developing the game. We were coming from a place where we had seen so many games previous with activation count, especially alternating activation, where the bigger, powerful characters, the smaller teams, really struggled against the horde of grunts, right? And we set out with this whole thing where we were like, we really don't want that to happen. We don't want to see players go for Hydra Bobs over Hulks. We want Hulk to feel powerful. We want Hulk to be a legitimate choice. Again, going back to choice for players. And so what we did with that initial design, and what I tried to write into the rules, and what Pagani and I worked on really heavily when we were developing that design out, is to ensure that an activation system did not prioritize or penalize a smaller team. And I think we did our job a little too well, is what we discovered, right? In that the way in which activation passes, and having the last activation means you can't have the first activation and that kind of thing, plus the daising mechanics, which removes activations and how that interacts with the activation system and all these things. It led to a situation where you take that and then you combine it with the idea that, okay, we're going to solve the activation and the horde army, kind of like the power of having lots of activation. And I think that's still very powerful in Crisis Protocol, but we obviously solved for that quite well. The other part to that equation was we said, okay, if you're taking a 6th threat character, they only get 1 activation. 2 3 threats get 2 activations. So if you do the math, it's 4 actions to 2 actions, right? Already I have 2 more actions and I have an extra activation over you. So whenever we do a high threat character, we kind of have to bake into the idea, or the fact that this character needs to do slightly more than 2 3 threats, or it needs to come in the middle. So that's where you got a lot of those design keys. If you look at like 5 threats and especially 6 threats, you kind of see that they get like pseudo 3 activations, or they get pseudo 3 actions. Sorry, not activations, in an activation, to make up for the fact that the smaller teams lose activation strength and they lose action economy. However, right, as the game developed and as players got really good at the game, and we started to get better at designing and developing these characters and really started to like push what our understanding and our knowledge was of what we could do with these characters, especially the higher threats. And that interacted with how the crises were made and how we kind of moved forward with that. What happened was we created the opposite problem, which was that small teams became so efficient at micromanaging the turn, they were able to bring all of those strengths that we gave them to counterbalance the strengths of the wider teams to bear faster and to effectively be more killy. So they could close the gap in the activation disparity very quickly. They could control when they went, which was really huge. And of course, once they closed that gap and they basically evened the numbers, they were now obviously way higher threat. So we've learned a lot about how that effect has happened, how those things went. And I think where that problem or that issue really raised up and became very apparent was during the Malekith CGR kind of development cycle. And this is to give kind of an interesting insight into the whole process and why it can feel like these, quote unquote mistakes are made like back to back, is because by the time we learn that something is a problem, we are past the point of fixing it on anything that comes next, right? Because it's a 2-year cycle. So Malekith and Cosmic Ghost Rider were both released within a year of each other. That means that they, like, by the time that we saw the effect that Malekith was having, that we started to learn more of these lessons and get more insight into how these higher threats were starting to bully the game in ways that we didn't intend because of the things we had done to try to make sure that they didn't get pushed out of the game, but instead remain viable choices. We swung the pendulum too far in their favor. Cosmic Ghost Rider was already a print, right? Cosmic Ghost Rider was already gone. So by the time that he hit the shelves, we were kind of in the point where we're like, okay, let's solve this problem. We have recognized that there's an issue. We now need to address it. What do we do with that? And that meant that it felt like to the community, to the player base at large, that we were just repeating sins of the past. And it's like, why can't they figure it out? It's like, well, we didn't know, right? We literally did not have that information at the time that we were working on these characters. We had the playtest feedback that we were getting and our internal playtest and analysis and all this stuff based on where the game was at the time. And where the game was at the time is not where those characters come out. So development is this really weird process of looking into the future, crystal balling it and saying, well, this is where we are. This is where we want to push players to go. All this stuff will kind of come to pass. And that's why it's always about the extremes, right? We never really know where a character is going to hit on the balance curve. What we're really trying to do is make sure that a character does not clearly violate the bottom or the top, and that it falls appropriately on that curve. And that's usually where those rebalances come from, is that, our meta internally, our playtesters meta, the number of games we played, we misjudged an ability. We didn't see an innovation that a player would have, in one of their games, that kind of stuff. And we have to adjust. But I think, hopefully, right, we've had a number of 6 threats released in the last year. We've had Nova, we've had Phoenix, we've had a few others. And thus far, it seems like and you can tell me if I'm wrong, the community definitely will. But thus far, we have not seen another Malekith, we have not seen another Cosmic Ghost Rider. I think we've kind of gotten to a point where we've recognized the fundamental issues and we've been able to adjust. And we've been able to bake that in. Some of that is like, those higher threat characters don't typically have a character throw superpower anymore. They have it built into their spender. That also comes back to the challenge that we have where we want players to use those big flashy spenders. Like, you want to see them use their ultra move on the fighting game. That's when it's really exciting, when you berserker barrage across the screen and everything turns white and you get the super finish. Like, that is really the DNA of Crisis Protocol. But as I think we talked about a little bit, what you spend power on is a really tight economy. And so we recognized that we weren't making spenders, to use the colloquial term or the community term, we weren't making those spenders worth the investment over some of the superpowers. So instead, we started to work character throws into the spenders, which makes them more enticing because character throws are really powerful. It also curtails character throws because now you have to spend an action to do the character throw, and you have to spend the power. So it's kind of a double hit, and it starts to really bring down some of those characters that had an outsized impact. Now Thor still gets that, and hence why we often look at Thor, Prince of Asgard, and say that guy's still really good because he's one of the few that's kept it. And all of that. So that kind of like comes down to, what were some of the mistakes, right? A lot of it was baked into the DNA of the game in terms of trying to solve for problems that we had with other games and trying to avoid the sins of the past, right? Making sure that high threat small teams were still functional, that you could still play competitively. So we're going to do these things. We're going to solve these problems from these other game experiences with this development and design. And then we walked into a new set of problems because we did the job too well. So we've had to kind of readjust for that, right? And I think there's also like it's impossible to say because it's always a dialogue and we're always taking in feedback from players, and we want to make things that are exciting to players and that players are going to want to play and they're going to want to collect and they're going to want to paint and they're going to put on the table and all that stuff. And the thing that often is very enticing to players is like offensive output. Does it kill things really well? And so when you have a set of characters or a big set of releases and everyone's like, yeah, but they're kind of soft. Like, I wish they did more. I wish they were a bit more like killy. And then okay, cool, I can do that. We can amp this up a little bit, right? We want to give the people what they want within the bounds of the game. So players want more offensive output. Let's give them a little more offensive output. Players want a little bit more reliability. Let's give them a little bit more reliability. Ideally, still within the bounds of what we've created. Sometimes that can go too far. Sometimes that tweak can have unintended consequences that you see later. So this is why it's so important that we have the ability in these living games. And I think, especially in the modern age, one of the great things is that we can rebalance and we can disseminate that rebalance without the need for a whole edition change, right? Where are my 90s gamers? If you wanted your army to get fixed, you had to wait until the new edition came out, and then you had to buy all the new books so that it would be fixed, right? And that was 5 to 8 years, maybe it was never. You never knew. You just lived with what you got. Nowadays, we are blessed with the ability to be able to do periodic rebalances and to more finely adjust these things to make sure that the game stays healthy and exciting and fun at a more persistent clip. But of course, we also have to be careful with that great power. There must also come great responsibility. You can't just start shaking the snow globe nonstop, because that doesn't create a stable or safe environment either, right? We take those changes to like Malekith and Cosmic Ghost Rider, where we're taking something that a player in good faith enjoyed playing all this stuff, but is having an outsized and negative impact on the game as a whole very seriously, right? We don't want to be down-tuning characters. We want to be presenting and distributing, characters to players that are solid, and maybe they need some tweaks here and there, and maybe we can make that experience better. But overall, right, we want to maintain consistency and we want to maintain as perfect as possible so that there can be confidence, among the player base that this game is good and it's solid, and you don't have to worry about, well, I got this, but now it does this. That's really weird. Like, what's happening here? And this isn't even the thing that I wanted. So it's a challenge and it's an interesting one, but if you ever kind of see one of those systemic issues, right, like 6 threats or 6-7 threats, because Malekith was a 7 and that kind of stuff, and you're like, why do they keep making the same mistakes? The chances are, if you look at the tightness of release, it's because we haven't had the opportunity yet to show you the new development, right? When we were adjusting for Malekith and Cosmic Ghost Rider and learning all of that new data and how it affected the game, that was right at the time when we were working on Phoenix and Nova and all these other ones that just came out. And so ideally, you can look at those and say, oh, look at how they learned these lessons. They just happen to be a year or so apart because of how the timelines work.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's I can imagine the difficulty. It would be a razor's edge trying to balance the priority mechanic with higher threat models. It's just fundamentally very difficult. And I will say, in defense of the characters when they on release, or the the development of the characters, they didn't feel like super overpowered on release, I would say.
Mhm.
It was only when they got into the hands of the community and they started brainstorming and like coming up with the broken combos, and that's another issue, I guess, with like internal playtesting is like when you release it to the public, the amount of games being played and the amount of brainstorming and combinations and craziness, like it increases exponentially, and you kind of like, it's almost like a Pandora's box where it's like, it could, it might seem okay on release, and then it gets just nutty.
Yeah, like I said, that's one of the exciting and terrifying things of doing this work, is that you just never know, and you have to be okay with that. And I think really, if you try to micromanage a game, you'll fail every time. You have to be willing to create something. Like, you have to be able to make your child and then hand it over to a community and say, okay, what is it going to become? Because I don't get to control it. And I always call it a dance. There's a bit of it's like a dance, and there's no leader. So there's push-pull tension. Like, we as developers and designers will engineer problems into the game. We will intentionally push a certain part of the meta or a certain part of the game in order to present challenges and trouble to the community that we believe there are answers to in the back, in all the things that have released, or just to see how the community can come up with solutions to it. And then we'll also put in those issues knowing that we're going to engineer solutions to them with new questions later. And I think that's part of the cyclical cycle of these games that makes them interesting and exciting, is that players are doing the same thing to us as developers. They're like, oh, but I figured out how to do this with this. And we're like, well, that's pretty cool. Didn't think of that. We should probably come up with something that kind of counterbalances that, because there's not really anything that exists in the game. So it is, and Pagani says this all the time. He's like, we could play test for 5 years and we still probably wouldn't get to the number of games played in the first 3 months. So there is that situation where it's just like, here's Malekith, here it comes. And, as much as the community can be wrong on the power level of something being less and then finding out it's more, been with the game long enough. You remember when Ebony Maw got shown off and he was gonna obliterate the game completely. Like, he was gonna ruin everything. And then we all know how that turned out. He didn't. He wound up being pretty low on the curve overall. So the hot takes moments is always one of the best parts. And we gotta live it twice.
He ended up sharing gems with Thanos. That was his problem.
It's true. Well, and he was pretty high threat and all of that, and so he didn't quite fit into the team. There were a few things that I think kept him from popping off, but yeah. So it's a fun time. It's definitely a fun. Like I said, it's a dialogue. It's a dance, and it's one of those things where you kind of do all of your due diligence, hope for the best, and then when we need to, we go in and we make adjustments to make sure the game is the awesome game that we all love and want to put on the table.
Yeah, I'd imagine it's another razor edge as well to try to develop characters who will have an impact on the meta, where they'll be actually taking over the previously existing 200 whatever characters, but also not break the game. I'm sure that's a delicate dance.
Yeah, that comes back to the discussions point that we had previously, though, which is that we don't, because we develop from theme first, and we're just trying to develop the best feeling character we can. As long as they're on the curve, we're happy with it. We're not necessarily trying to develop for competitive edge or to push other things out, right? So we trust that Marvel is so compelling and that players have a larger attachment than just the game rules, that when we make a cool character and they do some fun things and they're fun to play on the tabletop, even if they're not the top end 1% competitive like choice, they're still going to do well within the community, because at the end of the day, player skill, dice luck, all of those other things will come into play with it. It's, if you're only and this is the problem, right? It's like, well, don't you want everything to be better than the last thing? Well, not really, because if you do that, then you're just developing for power creep, because the only way to make it better than the last thing is to make it better, and then that moves that just pulls the curve so far that now you're kind of in that pay to win situation where it's like, if you don't have the newest stuff, sorry, kid. Like, and we put too much time, passion, hobby, like all this stuff into our collections and these miniatures and these characters, that I think that is just, that would be completely unsuccessful, and it's not a long-term strategy. Whereas we believe if we just make the game feel the most Marvel it can, make these characters feel as much the characters that we love from the comics and the other Marvel media as we can, then players will just play with the characters that they want to play with, and they should see decent amounts of success with that. And if you are, in that small subset of players, it's just like, I want to win Worlds every year, your analysis will be different. But I don't think that's the aggregate of players in general. And even within that smaller slice of like super competitive players, I've met a lot of them who play characters that they know aren't the top 1% of characters because they like the character, right? They just happen to be skilled enough that they can get a lot out of them. So the strategy so far, I think, has worked well. It's just make a great Marvel game and, people will come and enjoy it.
I think it is a testament to the game design as well that there's several characters in the core box who are still highly competitive 5 years later or whatever it is.
Yeah, I'm very happy with that. Obviously, we had to do a couple of rebalances, in that first balance pass to kind of make that happen. But it is talking about things that we feel very passionate about. Making sure that starter set, that core box experience is, universal and consistently valuable is really important to us. I've always had the mentality of I've played a lot of games. I've bought into a lot of introductory or starter sets. It always frustrated me when I got like a taste of the game, or when I got into the game, it was like, yeah, now if you want to actually play, go out and get these 5 other things or these 20 other things. So when we set out to make the core box and to pick the characters and everything, it was really important just from a philosophical standpoint and personal standpoint that a player can literally only buy the core set and be set for the life of the game. They may not always be at the top edge of the competition, right? But they should be able to go into any game store on any game night and feel like they can play competently and play the full experience with that core set, because it is the core set. From there, you build out. So I'm still very, very happy and satisfied that has remained a largely accepted community point. I'm sure people have different opinions, but we do see some of those characters popping up quite a bit. So it's really great.
Well, we really appreciate both all the time and all the insight that you provided. Do you have any kind of like a closing thought or a message you'd like to provide to the audience as we kind of wind things up?
No, I don't think there's anything like too big. Obviously, thanks so much for playing the game, for engaging with us, for letting us do what we do. We wouldn't be here without the amazing community. And thank you guys so much for putting your time, passion, and energy into being kind of, connectors of the community and providing a place for people to have dialogue and allowing me to come on and rant for like 90 minutes and steal one of your shows. So I know how much effort and work and energy it goes into like making these things, having done it as part of my job gig in previous positions. So the fact that, anytime somebody's doing this just for the love of the game and for the passion of the community, I'm super blown away and very humbled by it. So thank you so much for having me on. Hopefully I'll get to come back and maybe we'll bring some other AMG folk as well.
That'd be great. And I think for our group, we also want to express our appreciation to Atomic Mass Games for making a game that we all have so much fun with. If anything that lives on the internet, you're always going to get all kinds of opinions, as you so politely said. But I just think it's important that that there's a lot of people who really appreciate the work that you do and are very thankful for it. So awesome. Thanks again. We're looking forward to seeing what comes next. Webheads, thank you so much for staying with us. And until next time, be good.